So today and in the future, keeping student data safe is as high of a priority as ever. And I'm delighted this afternoon to have district leaders and privacy experts share their thoughts about what districts need to know to keep student data safe. And so we'll jump into our conversation. And as I said, there will be time for a Q&A afterwards. So first up, I'd like to introduce Mindy Frisby, who is the Senior Director of Learning Partnerships at ISTE and a former colleague. Mindy, tell us a little bit about your work as it relates to privacy and what is the biggest change that you've seen in this space that has emerged since the start of the pandemic?
Hi, Tony. It's great to see you. It's great to see everybody here. Yeah, so I'm Mindy Frisby, Senior Director of Learning Partnerships at ISTE. My role around data practices, data privacy, interoperability, the work that I do at ISTE is really about how we can empower educators to be conscious about their data practices, be involved in the data practices and the data culture within schools and districts. One of the projects that I'm working on is in partnership with CCSSO and the Council of the Great City Schools to really look at how we can improve state and district systems to prioritize interoperability and privacy and data practices throughout their system. So super excited about working on that project. Your question about biggest change in the privacy and security issues. I'd have to say just the increased visibility and importance around the potential of data, both good and bad, right? With more stakeholders being more front and center involved through flexible learning environments, whether it's at school, going between school and home, parents being more involved at home or seeing what tools their students are using, where really didn't have that line of sight before, so that more stakeholders are involved, that visibility and the importance has really increased, and being more transparent about what those data practices are.
Thank you, Mindy. Next up, we have Tim Harper. He's the Chief Information Officer at Seminole County Public Schools. Tim, tell us a little bit more about your work as it relates to privacy, followed by the biggest change that you've seen in terms of privacy and security issues that have emerged since the pandemic.
So our work in Seminole County, and we're a school district, public school district in the Central Florida area, roughly about 67,000 students and a little over 8,000 employees, 4,500 of those being teachers. Our work as an IT shop in this particular area over the past three and a half years has been to put in a formal procedure or system, if you will, of how we vet apps and make sure that appropriate, like you said, Tony, instructional applications are being used in the classroom. So we did kind of start this journey about 3.5, maybe 4 years ago. And I quickly realized that we need to broaden our definition of this and not just look at student data, but we talk about all of our stakeholder data. So that includes employees of the system, students, and also the parent data that we have in our student information system, for example. So we feel that we are guardians of that data. We want to make sure that we know where the data is residing, where those data or who those data are being used by, and then what or how are the data going to be handled during that point in time when we sever the relationship with the ed tech vendor. So one of the things that I have noticed over the past year is, and in a good way actually, is that there's a lot more sensitivity and awareness to where data are going in the instructional applications, because after all, I think most of us as educators, and I am a former classroom teacher, we've been sitting in front of computers helping our students work through a lot of these different instructional applications. So I think we've actually moved the needle forward by maybe 3 to 5 years in terms of classroom teachers understanding how important it is to have good practices when it comes to monitoring where we're sharing data and who we're sharing data with.
Great. Thank you, Tim. Great to have you on. Next up, I'd like to introduce Elizabeth Laird, who is the Director of Equity and Civic Technology at the Center for Democracy and Technology. Elizabeth, tell us a little bit about your work and from your perch, what the biggest changes have been.
And thank you for all of that. I know it's a lot of technologies in one phrase. So I'm Elizabeth. I lead the Equity and Civic Technology Project at CDT. I'm going to use that as shorthand. I know we don't need any more acronyms, but it is much faster to say. And that organization is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization based in Washington, D.C. And what I spend my time doing is advocating for the responsible use of data and technology by public agencies with a specific and deeper focus in education. And part of that focus necessarily includes privacy, which we'll talk a lot about today, but I did just want to set the frame that, and those of you, many of you who are our districts know this, that something can be private, it can be legal, it can be secure, and still not a good idea. So I think we'll cover some of that today too, and have this be a student-centered conversation and what is best for them. In terms of my background, I want to just start by saying I'm a graduate of Katy Public Schools outside Houston. So I see some Texas people in the chat, so go Tigers. In addition to that, my background is I worked at state education agencies on various data, technology, and privacy issues in DC and in Louisiana, and I'm actually coming to you from New Orleans today. And then to Tony's question, you know, I'm not going to come to an EdTech webinar without a little bit of data. So one of the things that we do at CDT is try and lift up the voices of those who are maybe have the most at stake, but oftentimes aren't part of these conversations. So we've done research on views toward privacy among teachers, parents, and students. And so I'll just highlight a couple of those changes to maybe set the context for today. We're starting by saying, you know, what's not new is privacy. You know, you all have been dealing with privacy for decades. So I do think it's an important question to distinguish between what are general privacy issues and what's actually new. And so along those lines, we released some results of some research, and what we found, and you all should feel very good about this, is we have seen better privacy practices and policies being done in schools and at the district level. And that looks like training more teachers, having, you know, school policies that explicitly address privacy and security, having more conversations with families and with parents. So that's the good news. The bad news is that we do see across the board and can quantify some of what's already been discussed, which is parents and teachers are more concerned about privacy as a result of the pandemic than they were before. A third of parents and a third of teachers are more concerned than they were prior to the pandemic. And even in spite of all of the progress that has been made in schools and districts, we haven't actually seen a corresponding decrease in concerns among parents and teachers. So there's still a long way to go. So I'm excited about today's conversation, and we'll turn it back to Tony.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And we'll be sure to dive into more of the insights that your team has uncovered, you know, in recent months. And last but not least, we've got David Liu on our panel. He's the general counsel at Clever. David, how big of a part does privacy and security play in your role? And has there been any big changes that you've seen since you've joined?
So I have the privilege of having joined Clever during the pandemic. And so what I've sort of walked into is this huge increase in the use of Clever specifically and in EdTech more broadly. Actually, since the pandemic, we've actually seen usage of Clever increase by 92%. And again, this sort of mirrors the broader rapid adoption of EdTech across the industry. Not surprisingly, sort of what this translates into is an experience that is very similar to what everyone else on the panel has already said, which is a much greater focus on privacy and security from our schools and from our individual users. And like the other panelists, I actually see that this is a great opportunity to further increase awareness of these issues and hopefully change people's practices for the better. At Clever, we sort of view security as having three main components. There's product security, which focuses on the security and privacy impact of new features and products. There's infrastructure security, which looks at the underlying systems like AWS, upon which we can build more secure and more privacy protective products. And finally, there's IT security, which examines the individual side of security, passwords, malware, and the like. The great thing about Clever is, as I think many of you know, is that we do the product security and the infrastructure security on the back end, so districts don't have to worry about these items when they use Clever. What we can't control is IT security for individual users. And I know that many schools are increasingly concerned about how you help users keep login credentials confidential and keep themselves safe from phishing and ransomware and other attacks. There's obviously no single solution. We hope that Clever single sign-on, as well as features like Parent Portal, which makes it easier for parents to help their children log in, Clever Badges, which makes it easy for young kids to access their Clever account, and a new product that some of you may not know about, Clever IDM Enterprise, which integrates Clever with Rapid Identity to manage Google and Microsoft user accounts, can help simplify some of these challenges and be part of the solution.
Thank you, David. Great, and I see that we now have 233 participants in the call. This is a pretty sizable number, so welcome everyone. I don't think I introduced myself. I am the former managing editor at EdSurge, and so for nearly a decade, I've been covering the ed tech industry and written about Clever and other industry leaders and school districts in this space. And it's been a pleasure to moderate many and facilitate many conversations like this, and look forward to doing more of these going forward. So thank you everybody for introducing yourselves and a little bit at a high level what you've seen in this space. One of the common things that I think you've all shared is that concerns and issues around privacy and security are not new by any means. But I am kind of interested in kind of like what are some of the new concerns that have emerged, and especially in the context of the pandemic. The fact that a lot of teachers and educators may have been looking for and trying edtech tools for the first time during this pretty chaotic period. What are the kinds of new tools that are now in use in homes and classrooms that do pose kind of new or different kinds of privacy or security concerns that you've seen? And I'm going to open it up to the floor now for any of our panelists to jump in. Who wants to start?
I can start.
Great.
So I would offer a couple of places. And one is in products that are not edtech products at all, but they are products that were designed for consumers that are being used in an education context. And maybe the best example of that is one that we're on today, Zoom or other video conferencing platforms that were not designed for education purposes, but having a really critical role in playing an important function in, especially during remote learning. And I bring that up because the privacy issues there are that they may not, because they weren't designed to be used in an educational context. Other tools like Clever, for example, that knows who they're going to be serving, they design them with that use in mind and with legal compliance and different kinds of features, but these tools were not. So a lot of that onus falls on schools and school districts to still make sure that they are legally compliant, and like areas to look are some of these tools don't have ways to delete data. Well, if that data is provided by the school, that's a legal requirement. You have to be able to back that data out. And so that may be something you have to negotiate, or in some cases you can't use a consumer facing tool because it doesn't actually meet the floor of legal compliance. So I would offer that. And then I also think just in terms of teacher training, what we found is there are gaps in what teachers probably need to be trained on and what they're being trained on. So a lot of the training happening around legal compliance and not the emerging tools. So like how do you secure a video conference platform so that it's not Zoom bombed, which landed a number of people in the news for all the wrong reasons. So I would also add, it's not just the tool itself, it's also the support and infrastructure that's provided around it that I think we also saw some gaps.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Piggyback off of that too, and just kind of underscore what Elizabeth said, that it's there's lots of new tools. There's always new tools, and yes, the consumer-facing tools, but it's also really important to acknowledge that there's increased risk with how things are being implemented and adopted, right? So how do you know what are the practices in order to implement it, in the best security and the best interest of the students and their data, and really thinking critically and intentionally around that.
Tim, you said, even before all of this, that, vetting products was a big part of, your responsibility or your team's responsibility. With all of these tools kind of being discovered and tried, especially during last year, what have you learned about what are new challenges or new ways to vet, properly vet, all these new tools that are now people are coming across either on social media or being pitched on?
So, well, first of all, Tony, I'll go back to what Elizabeth said, and quickly on into the pandemic, going back to March of 2020, we realized and recognized that there were multiple platforms for video conferencing that teachers were using, mostly because they had used them in the past and they were comfortable with them. But unfortunately, as a large system, we did not have agreements in place, which protects a lot of things, including data. and the privacy of the data. It goes well beyond that, but it obviously focuses on that. So I think we did a pretty good job. I won't say that we're perfect, but we did say that there are basically 2 platforms that are authorized in Seminole County Public Schools for educators to use. And likewise, it's very important that the rest of us at the district level or even at the school level, if you're an administrator, for example, as a principal, or me, for example, that I model that. So I might be partial to one platform and have used it for years for whatever purposes, but I need to make sure that I use the 2 that are authorized by the district. So I think we transitioned to that pretty quickly. Again, I don't think we're perfect in that aspect. I am a little bit concerned, like you said, because it's been sort of the wild, wild west as far as teachers going out and maybe experimenting different instructional applications, with wow factors. But we really need to concentrate on the ones that have been vetted by the school district. And I always try to make sure that we have the mindset that we're not an obstacle to what teachers need and want to do in the classroom with their students. We want to be an extension of what they're doing in the classroom. So we want to make sure that we're helping them vet the applications and reading. Hardly anybody, including me, read privacy policies and agreements with the applications that we download to our iPhones, for example. So I might download an application, but how many of us, use the click-through agreement? We never bother to read the details. So I'm pretty used to that now. I don't want teachers to spend 1 minute of their day reading those fine print legal documents. We want to do that for them so they can do what they do best, and that's teach our children. So we have actually a web-based application that we developed, as I mentioned before, 3.5 years ago. We really have used a lot of what has been done by other organizations out there. So for example, Common Sense. And we have 4 badges that we give an application. We go through their data privacy policies. We actually put our data privacy policy on top, and we give them anything from green to red and the 2 colors in between as far as use for within the district. But back to your question, what I am concerned about is what have they been using during this past year during the pandemic? They've been logging on through Home. And that's where a portal like Clever really helps, because it kind of brings everybody in through one space. Those applications have been vetted and approved, and then they can go out and do their job of teaching and learning, whether it's the teacher or the student. So that's kind of where we've transitioned. And as students begin to return face-to-face along with our teachers, and we expect that as we open 2021, 2022, they will be back fully face-to-face, at least in Florida, it sounds like, that we will start this process again of educating our stakeholders. And that includes not just educators, but students, parents, as was mentioned before, and others on the school campus. Bus drivers want to make sure that we're protecting their data. So it really is a lifestyle, and it's very global and kind of exciting, actually. Just hope that we don't hit a compromise.
Tim, you mentioned that you mentioned something specific that sounded interesting. You said your team has developed its own kind of rating system to that reflects. Does it reflect kind of the security and privacy protection practices of each vendor?
Yes, sir. Yes, it does, and it also reflects whether they have agreed to our data sharing and privacy agreement. Mm-hmm. Which is a pretty lengthy document. Of course, I have to give credit to the other organizations out there nationally mm-hmm. who have been working on this. Mm-hmm. But for example, if you hit the highest bar, you are green. That means you are cleared for use throughout the district K through 12, if it's applicable for that particular grade level.
Now, for districts that may not have something like this in place, are there existing frameworks out there that can kind of help them build this? So that they don't have to build it entirely from scratch? Anything that either you or other panelists have seen that could be helpful?
Absolutely, and I am the least of the experts on the panelists, so I know Elizabeth and Mindy will have more to say about this. But as I mentioned before, the Common Sense Education, Access for Learning, these are 2 different organizations who have been heavily involved in this particular area. We've been using the Common Sense Media Framework for the most part as far as the badging is concerned. And I'm very impressed with what they've done. It's helped us not to have to recreate the wheel, but really model our practices after their best practices, for example. But again, I know Elizabeth and Mindy will have more input on that area.
Yeah, I agree. You know, common sense is a great way, and I know districts have developed their own, you know, vetting systems. And I think that's what's important, right? That you're going through the process and the steps of looking at what the privacy policies are and matching that against the district's needs and requirements. And you know, one word of caution, though, is that while those badges and vetting systems, those external ones, are always very useful, they're one step in the process, right? So making sure that it's always mapped back to what it being, having the district be clear about what their particular requirements are, that they communicate to the vendor on top of that badging system as well, because no badge can ever, or certification can never cover it all. So I always, you know, talk to people about it's important to have the conversations. It's important to involve all the stakeholders at the table. You know, talking to the teachers about what the instructional needs are, what are the data needs, getting the data needs from all the stakeholders in a particular solution and mapping that against what the tool is providing.
And I would add, on what everyone has said, I agree with everything. But I would add that most of the tools and frameworks that folks have talked about are related to dealing with vendors. And when I was in a state, you know, I felt like we had to get our own house in order too. So I'll just point out some that are focused on doing the work inside your district. And so one of them is that, like, that's who our main audience is. So we put out a lot of guidance and training that's directed toward school district and state practitioners and policymakers on these issues. And they're mostly focused on how do you do better with the data that's still a technology that's in your direct control and that you yourself maintain. Another group is the Consortium of School Networking, and they have a trusted learning environment seal that some districts have chosen to pursue. And if you have it, you could do a little shout out in the chat right now. And then another group that I hope everyone is familiar with, and I know I relied on them very heavily, is the Privacy and Technical Assistance Center, which is a technical assistance center arm of the U.S. Department of Education that provides a lot of support. And if you're in a school district or a state, it is incredibly helpful to be able to say, well, the Department of Education, who enforces FERPA, said this. So if you haven't used them as a resource, they have a lot of great resources. They'll also, you know, respond to individual questions. So I would put them out there as another resource.
I would like to actually maybe just note as another pitch for one of our products. I do think that many of you are familiar with the Clever App Store, which is another great resource for getting a sense of how other teachers have rated different applications. I think that we found that, you know, teachers who we know have used these apps often have unique insights into how these apps will perform in the classroom. And we also provide demos of these apps so that before you have to provide any of your personal information to any third party or sign up for a mailing list or otherwise expose yourself to spam and unsolicited communications, the Clever App Store is a great place to sort of check these things out. I think a lot of you are also familiar with the Clever Library, which is a great system for providing a very limited amount of, you know, personal information to apps and to actually use them in your classrooms. But one organization that I did want to call out is providing a great legal standard is, of course, the Student Data Privacy Consortium and the National Data Privacy Agreement, which is something that we have been sort of involved in creating and maintaining since the very beginning. I'm happy to say that Clever has actually signed NDPAs in many, many states. And I saw one question earlier that I will proactively just call out. We have signed the NDPA with probably about 3 dozen districts in Illinois already. And this is sort of in, you know, sort of response to SOPA, which comes into effect this year. And we're very happy to say that we are compliant with SOPA. And one way that we have become compliant is by entering into the NDPA, which is a wonderful legal framework and a wonderful sort of broadly vetted standard that is out there and is available to everyone.
Great. And piggybacking off of that, David, I mean, to Elizabeth, Tim, or Mindy, in terms of guidance from a district or a state level, you know, from the regulatory and policy standpoint, have you seen a lot of momentum and traction around, you know, where states are providing guidance to help districts and perhaps vendors basically outline pretty clearly, you know, what is and isn't acceptable for ed products from a privacy and security standpoint? Is it more clear, or are states' policies pretty much in alignment, or are they kind of like, you know, 50 states all doing their own thing? What's the latest on this landscape these days?
I can share a fun data point, Tony.
Okay.
So I think at this point, we're up to 130 state student privacy laws. So if you
Wow.
count the number of states, so in terms of the legal landscape, I think it's very complex. And I think, some of those laws are, modeled on other states, but some of them aren't. And in the states I've worked in, they were totally different laws with totally different areas of focus. But I do think, in terms of legislation, I do think actually in both Louisiana and DC, we were able to use that as an opportunity to have a broader conversation about privacy. So it wasn't just about how do we, not violate this law, but how do we have a conversation about protecting students online? And so I do think for those states that have had to implement legislation, which I think at this point is almost all of them, it does give an opening to have a conversation with school districts and train them on not just how do you not break this law, but how do you do right by students and their families.
I want to kind of segue into this very long multi-syllable word that I think is part of this conversation. And the context of it is that, as we use more and more tech tools and services, these apps are not used, in isolation, right? Very often different ed tech apps and services share data and pass them with one another. And so, in my past coverage, studying how systems share data with one another is, called interoperability. I know this has been kind of a long effort that's been in the works for many years in the tech space. But in terms of interoperability and how tech tools and services can share data securely with one another, what is the importance of this in supporting privacy and security in this day and age?
I'll jump in and say, I think interoperability is key, is one key part of privacy and security, right? So interoperability is basically just the sharing of data between applications, and then we want to make, privacy is sharing the data with the right people at the right time for the right needs, right? So when you think about, the importance of interoperability and at least creating a structure or a system for that data sharing to happen in a relatively safe and secure way, I think making sure tools that are aligned to interoperability standards, industry standards is really key. It can't stop there, right? It also comes down to what do you do, like if you don't have interoperability, the risks that are introduced are, teachers are having to download files of data, right? And then manually synthesize them or email them to each other, which is not a safe and secure way. It's definitely not, not aligned with best data practices. And so the less, the more you can reduce those needs for the teachers to put the data together to make a whole picture, a picture of the whole child and the whole student, the better. And that's why interoperability, I think, is really important for facilitating the data-driven decision making.
And I think if I could just also offer not the downside of interoperability, but in terms of privacy, sharing more data and doing it easier and better is not always a good thing. And when we talk to parents, that is actually where a lot of their concerns are, is data moving around. And it sounds like in Mindy's description, it was, within education systems, but there are also efforts to share that with other sectors. And so to use, I think I got it, but the right people at the right time to meet the right needs. Did I get it, Mindy? So like all of that is laden with value judgment, right? So like it's really, and that's where the privacy conversation comes in, and how to use it responsibly is you have to have opinions about what all of those things are, and really ask yourself is this in the student's interest to share this data? And sometimes you'll find, and I would play this role, the answer is no, it's actually not, and that's okay. So I definitely agree with all that Mindy said in reducing human error, and there's a huge role for interoperability to play in terms of that. But it's also important to remember that sharing more data isn't always better, and sometimes it can actually hurt students.
Yeah, in terms of interoperability standards, what is the state of that landscape these days? Over the past years, I've covered that there have been different data standards that have been proposed as, the one standard, right, for all education apps and services, and then new standards will emerge, which kind of can sometimes cause some confusion. But are we getting to, maybe one true standard in terms of interoperability for education apps and systems these days, or is it still kind of a work in progress?
Happy to jump in, but I'd love to hear what other panelists have to say as well. I think there are standards for different purposes and different uses, and that's why there are multiple standards out there. There are lots of really well-respected industry standards for interoperability, EdFi, IMS, right there, and they all play a really crucial role. Can a standard cover all use cases in all scenarios? No, and so there's always the need for that, solving a particular problem that maybe a particular standard hasn't solved all the way, or there's not a universal solution for it.
I'd like to maybe just echo what Mindy was saying. I think that there are different standards that do different things, but there are also different standards that different parties are comfortable with. And in the case of Clever, we obviously have our own APIs for ingesting SIS content, but we are also committed to one roster. In fact, we're one of the very few companies that have done the 1.2 one roster certification. We're a founding member of the IMS Global Steering Committee, and we actually import and export more one roster files than anyone. And so, I think Mindy's right. There are different standards out there. I don't think that there's a lot of consolidation. And one thing that we're committed to, and look, this is something that we hope helps schools, is to sort of understand the standards that schools want and make our system adaptable to those standards.
Mm-hmm. Now, Clever is a kind of conduit, right, for data traveling across this, schools and solution providers. Do you try to hold every vendor you work with to a certain level of standard? And is it a challenge to arrive at some kind of common ground of consistency sometimes, given how many apps you work with?
That's a great question. And I think one interesting thing about what we do is, obviously we work with a lot of the larger apps, but we also work with a lot of smaller apps. And in this time of, great ed tech innovation, we're oftentimes working with apps that have never done things like this before. So there are three things that we do to sort of make sure that app developers sort of are ready to jump into this large sea. One, before turning on an integration, we test all integrations with developers to make sure that these are secure and working properly. This can often be a very involved process, especially for new players in the space. But we want to make sure that what we put out there and the data that comes through is secure, and that it's also consistent, that the uptime will be there so that schools can actually rely on this. Secondly, we require all developers to sort of comply with their agreement with the school. And we expect that all developers will have their own agreement with the school. And two, we require all developers to comply with applicable law. So obviously this means FERPA, PPRA, COPPA, but this also means all the state laws that may be applicable, in a particular local jurisdiction. And then finally, and I think that this speaks to a lot of these sort of security standards that we're hopefully imposing and introducing to the larger community, we require that all developers must maintain sort of high security safeguards and notify and cooperate with Clever in the event of any security breach. And so, this is very similar to what you will see in, NY2D or in Illinois SOPA, but we want to make sure that here's another opportunity for school districts to have the assurance that when they work with these app developers, that these safeguards are in place.
Thank you, David. Now, privacy and security is not just a matter of, it's not just a data and a product issue. As our panelists have said, it's one of practice and implementation as well. Elizabeth, you shared earlier that one of the things that you've learned that might be a little bit troubling is relates to training for teachers, and that there are still some areas that are critical these days as they pertain to protecting privacy and security that you've seen evidence that may not be addressed as directly or thoroughly as they be as they may need to be. So Elizabeth, can you elaborate a little bit more on that, on like what the proper training level of training might be for teachers these days?
Yeah. I'll start with saying that we did see an uptick in the number of teachers being trained between when we did the survey last school year and this school year. So all of you who are doing that work in your districts, you should feel good about that. I think, but it's still, a little over half have received substantive training. And in some districts, they're still, just either not saying anything or requiring, a teacher to sign a form and that's it, which is not meaningfully developing their expertise or skill set in this area. And one of the findings that we asked about, and I'll just refer back to some of the opening comments about what has changed and maybe what we should be worried about. Actually, Tony, you talked about this, the cybersecurity incidents that we've seen. So we were interested in, well, what kind of training have teachers gotten on it? How many of them are clicking on cat pictures or, subject to, phishing attacks or ransomware attacks? And I'll say, and I think we know this, but, sometimes privacy and security can feel wonky and legal and boring, not among any of us, I'm sure, but, in the case of ransomware, where it results in schools shutting down for days at a time, the impact of that is students are not receiving instruction. And that is of critical importance, especially during a global crisis. So just to say why that issue matters and to put it in student terms, that's personally why I care about it. But we found that 3 in 4 teachers have never received training on ransomware and phishing attacks. So they wouldn't know how to look for a spoofed email and not click on that cute cat picture. And then similarly with video conferencing, even though we've seen the vast majority of them use it, 3 in 4 have not received training on how to use it privately and securely. And that plays out in some of the news that we've heard. And, again, to, put this in the context of students, there are stories about them being exposed to child sexual abuse material, to racist language, to bullying. So these have real impacts on students. So just to give you a sense of, my call to action would be is to not just focus on legal compliance as it relates to training, but think about what are the real threats to student well-being and their safety, and direct your training there. And we as an organization have tried to put out training that folks can just use. So we put out a 2-pager on ransomware. We're doing a security 101 training because, I know when I was in States, I didn't have time to do any of this. So if someone, would give it to me, I'd be like, great, we're doing this. So we're trying to plug that hole, but that would be my charge for all of us, is not just thinking of privacy as an issue of legal compliance, but one of student safety and well-being, and attacking those risks as the highest priority.
If I may, just add on to that too, Elizabeth, I agree with all of that. And, I also would add the opportunity that this provides to really speak to students and teachers about digital citizenship, right? So data is not limited to the education context or the education tools. It is about understanding how our data are used across our lives and within our actions in our context. And so, the importance of digital citizenship was being front and center in the classroom as a practice that teachers need to model, they need to embody, they need to understand. Students also need to understand where their data go, what they're doing with it, why somebody's asking for a login. I mean, as a parent, I am the last parent you want in your district, because I watch my kids and, a new tool comes up and he comes home and he's like, oh, guess what? My login is my first name and my password is my last name. I'm like, oh my God, that's not going to happen. So, it's really important to take this opportunity to really infuse digital citizenship throughout the curriculum as well.
Yeah,
Yeah,
Tim,
I'll add on to that. Yeah, I'll add on to that. Lots to say about the comments that have been made, but I think I probably mentioned this in the beginning. When we go out and work with our teachers and students, we found an opportunity through our PTAs actually to offer some evening events for parents. And as Elizabeth and Mindy have both said, I'm not really concerned necessarily about what's happening to our data, inclusively all of our data. Between the hours of 8 and 3 o'clock at an elementary school, for example, or 7:30 to 2:30 at a high school. I'm really worried about how we're training, as Mindy said, digital citizenship, how we're really educating and training people with best practices to protect themselves. After all, we spend more hours out of school for the most part, especially as we reach adulthood, right? So how are they carrying that? Our high school graduating seniors next month, are they carrying these practices with them as they go to the universities, the colleges, or as they go into the workforce? And the last thing that I want to do, I agree, some of the conversations about the laws and the legal language helping frame how we should be treating the data and protecting it. But when something does happen, and I think we've all been kind of trained to say it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when it's going to happen, and that's kind of what our mantra is here, as most IT shops. So at the end of the day, they're not going to go to FERPA and say, hey, what was wrong with this? They're not going to go to Clever and say, hey, what was wrong with this? They're going to come to me as the chief technology officer and say, why didn't you protect my child's data? So I need to make sure that we're doing the best job we can with the tools that we have. And I think it starts with education. We can spend $20 million a year. We don't have that much money in public education in one district to spend on cybersecurity. But if we did, we could spend $20 million and we'd still need another $20 million because it starts with the individual. That's who we have to train. One of the hardest things, and if anybody on the call, if they want to email me later, one of the hardest things that we have getting adults to do, believe it or not, and it starts internally. I think Elizabeth or Mindy mentioned this, cleaning house first. Lock your computer when you step away. In the classroom as a teacher, the other 20 kids in the classroom don't need to have the data of the one child that you may have been looking at in the grade book. Lock your computer when you step away from the computer. I don't ever remember seeing anybody step away from an ATM and leaving it wide open with their bank account, so available to the public. So why do we do that with the technology that we're responsible for? So it really is a lifestyle, I guess, is what it comes down to.
And Tim, sticking with you a little bit, with remote instruction, with students learning from home, how does that environment kind of increase the scope of responsibility that in terms of training that you have to provide now? I mean, do you find yourself needing to loop in parents and train parents more now around best practices around privacy and security? And how have you, and if you have to do that, like, what have you done?
Absolutely. And, we do have, and we probably will for some period to come, we still have a gap in generations when it comes to technology use. So there is that opportunity to train parents and guardians not only how to protect themselves, but how to protect their children, their grandchildren, for example. One of the things that we have in the Clever portal is a swim lane, if you want to call it that, of 5 different applications that any of our students, employees can go out and they can kind of take ownership of educating themselves on how to protect their data. So for example, we're really big about freezing your credit. And we talk to our grandparents, we talk to our parents, freeze your child's credit. Go out there, take the extra time, make sure you do this now so that when they turn 18 and they're applying for scholarships or a car loan or what have you, you don't have a big surprise that you don't want to have down the road. So there is that opportunity. I foresee that it is going to continue and in some cases maybe even grow. We know that the bad actors, they're not standing still and saying, hey, you know what, we just got a compromise in this particular school district, so we're pretty happy. They're continuing to evolve, so we have to continue to evolve, and that includes our education of stakeholders.
All right, I've seen that there are close to a dozen questions down in Q&A, and I think some of them are a good follow-up to that question. Let me start with the most recent one. And it's one that I think is probably what I've observed as a fairly common, maybe a common practice, albeit ill-advised one. It comes from Dan. Can anyone say anything about Google software like Sheets? My school system has become very accustomed to sharing individual level data sets to our Google account. Any thoughts on districts and school leaders sharing, passing Google Sheets around when it comes to sharing info?
I'll give you another school district speaking to that school district. It is a work in progress. With the big tech vendors, and I'll leave them unnamed, although one of them has been named, it is a work in progress. We like to think that in most cases we're in the driver's seat when it comes to protecting the data, because you want to ask, and I will mention, in the case of Google Sheets, how protected is that? And Google, yes, they have done a lot of work in securing data on their servers, but you still want to make sure that you have all the answers as to what protections are around that and what happens if there is a compromise. So there's still work to be done with the big tech vendors and bringing them into some of these data protection agreements, if you will. We're making progress, and in some cases we're kind of there, and in other cases we're still working on it with some of the big tech vendors. Mindy mentioned several minutes ago, and I think it's important to point this out as well. Once you have, and let's use Google for example, if you do happen to get an agreement with Google, once you have that agreement in place, and this goes for any, whether they're a small vendor or a large vendor, once you have that agreement in place, you're not done, because they can actually go back and change their privacy agreements at any time. So that's one of the big challenges for us, is keeping up with the changes that they have. We review our contracts and agreements on an annual basis, but those privacy policies on the vendor side, they can change any time in those 12 months. But you want to make sure that you come back and you review those, you update the language that you have to protect your students and employee data.
Great. Working up then, from Brian Davis, how does a vendor deal with all of the multiple different data privacy, I'm assuming, agreements and policies that are sent and must be signed if they are not a Clever client? So I'm not exactly, maybe reframing this question, is it, Brian, I mean, feel free to text, clarify your question in chat, but is your question around how do vendors, from their perspective, deal with all of the multiple data privacy agreements that are in place and navigate what may be different requirements?
So if I may, I can jump in a little bit about, I think this is a really important question, because it's a question that I hear a lot, I'm a vendor, I want to do right. I want to do right by my students, my users, the data. I just don't know what that is, because it's so confusing. There's so many different requirements or laws or standards out there. What do I do? Particularly as an earlier stage company, right? Like, I hear that a lot. And I don't think that, unfortunately, David, I don't think there's any real easy answer for you. We at ISTE are, that's one of the big reasons why we embarked on this project with CCSSO and Counsel Great City Schools is, yes, we're working with the states and the districts, but we also realize that the vendor needs to be part of that conversation. We absolutely cannot work with states and districts without also understanding the pain points and challenges from the vendor and provider. There are lots of obstacles and pain points and challenges when it comes to developing the right kind of solution or meeting the needs of your users. And I don't think it's a landscape that's easy to map. So my answer to you is, I would love to talk more. We are in the process of digging into that process, digging into those problems and trying to understand how we can help make connections. ISTE is a connection maker. That's what we do. We want to connect the conversations, dig in to see where we might be able to support the whole ecosystem. We've actually established a vendor advisory council we work with on a monthly, if not weekly basis, to try to dig into these interoperability and data privacy issues and understand what those pain points are. So let's keep the conversation open. I'm sorry, I don't have a great answer for you.
Can I speak from the other? Oh, go ahead,
Tim.
David. Well, from the other side of the table, I think the word for the day in this particular problem is flexibility. And I know that might not go over so well in some districts, but in our organization, and it takes a little time getting there with legal, to be honest with you, but be flexible. So even though we may have a data sharing and privacy agreement, we have had some startup companies say, hey, look, we just can't sign that. But if you take a look at their privacy policy, and maybe they have signed on to something else nationally or in one of the states that has a good privacy policy or law, if they have signed on to that, then be flexible. The last thing you want to do for the classroom teacher, as I said in the opening, is take away that opportunity for her or him to use what could be the next great instructional application.
And I was just going to note on my side, we talk with a lot of our developer partners who are often very small and often are very challenged by the huge amounts of paperwork that they get when they try to do the right thing and enter into the right sort of agreement with the district. Two quick thoughts. One, if the developer is sort of doing a free application we find that the Clever Library is a great way to sort of dip your toe into this space. The advantage of the Clever Library is, we have a very streamlined universal data sharing agreement that's available on our website that any app developer can sort of, I think, fairly comfortably sign on to. The disadvantage of Clever Library for app developers is we only provide the developer with first name, grade, and sort of the class of the individual student. So we do not provide that much personal information at all, right? And this is because we want to protect the schools and we want to protect the students. But this is obviously a barrier for a lot of application developers. For those developers who need, more personal information, I do think that this is where SDPC and the National Data Privacy Agreement is absolutely fantastic. It's a document that has been made in partnership between school districts and vendors and other stakeholders. And we found this to be a very fair and balanced approach to sort of protecting school districts for sure, but also giving vendors sort of one document that they can sign and that will work with many, many districts. It's unfortunately not truly national. The way that it works is state alliances agree to a version of that for their state, and then individual districts have to adopt that state version of the NDPA. But it's slowly getting traction, and we're very excited about how this might simplify the entire contracting process.
One of the questions that I have that I think Shannon just raised earlier in the Q&A is, well, Shannon directs this at Tim. Does your school system have a privacy officer? And if so, how do you coordinate with them? I'm curious in this myself because the title of Chief Privacy Officer is one that I've seen, be increasingly common from a technology vendor side in ed and elsewhere. But I'm curious to see if if we're seeing a trend where this role is necessary or should be required for most schools and districts. So Tim, what are your thoughts on a Chief Privacy Officer? Would that make your job any easier?
So one word, and I can speak for Seminole County Public Schools, absolutely. It is a requirement. One word, absolutely. All public school districts today, if you have the resources, you need to have a chief cybersecurity officer, CISO, if you want. We put one in place about 1.5 years ago. I cannot speak highly enough of the individual that we have in that role, and we've made some progress. So if you're a small district and you don't have the resources, but yet you're part of a consortium, I think there's some opportunities with that. But yes, public education, I would love to see a trend in that particular area. And it really, again, it's more than just within the scope of data privacy. There's so much more to that particular role in keeping us all safe.
Can I just add on to that too? I just threw in the chat. With the very first thing I did when I took this job was write this paper. So yes to everything Tim said, +1, +1, +1. And even if you are in a school district that can't dedicate a full-time employee to be your chief privacy officer, there's still better and smarter ways to staff it. And what I find in some school districts is they're still structured the same way that they were decades ago and not reflecting the new kinds of technology and data that's being collected. So in the paper I shared, there are some other ideas if you can't hire them. And one little anecdote, and Tony, it relates to you. When I wrote this paper, there was an article that EdSurge published about chief privacy officers being the unicorn of education. So I'm excited that you've been seeing more of them. I think that they need to not be unicorns or mythical creatures. They really should be real people. I was a chief privacy officer when I was in DC. We're seeing them more, and I think it's super important because most of the issues that we see related to privacy and security are human error. And you address that by building human capacity. And I think a chief privacy officer, whatever you want to call that role, is really important.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So we're coming up on time here, and I'd like to wrap up with one final question for all the panelists. Clearly, data privacy and security is an evolving issue for which there is no quick fix or a magic wand solution for it. But if there is one one tangible or pragmatic step that either the school district or vendors can take, today, that could be a step forward that's achievable, that's possible, but which is not common right now. what would your suggestion be for either schools or for EdTech service providers?
I guess I'll start. The first step in this journey, truly the first step in my opinion, is to know where your data are and who has it. So that really comes down to inventory. Do an inventory internally of what you're using and make sure that you can define down to every field in that table of data being shared with those vendors for your students and for your employees. And from there, you can continue the journey.
Thank you, Tim.
I mean, I think I would start with, I'm a process junkie. And because the field and technology and policy and needs and staff change, I would first set up what is a good process through which you can deliberate some of these things and making sure you have the right people at the table. And it's not just Tim's job. It wasn't just my job. Like, privacy is everyone's job. And it really should be aligned to what are your broader goals for educating all students and how does privacy fit into that? So I would put in place, a group of people who have the right perspectives that you need to make, student-centered decisions on some of these things.
That's a good segue, I guess, into mine. From my perspective, I would yes to all those, but I would also add the importance of professional learning for the educator, right? So keeping that conversation going, involving educators in the conversation about what the data practices are within the district, what are their needs, their instructional needs, how do they need to get the data, and infusing that throughout the procurement processes is also, as well as the implementation, and having that ongoing feedback loop. It's really important that, we can't expect educators to be privacy lawyers, but it's really important that they understand and model that for their students to be good stewards of their students' data and their data as well.
And to sort of close things out, I just want to say that I love what everyone said. What Tim said, I think, is certainly applicable to districts, but even more applicable to vendors. Sort of understanding how you use your data, having a good data map is absolutely essential to sort of making sure that you're doing right by your customers and protecting your data. And then, for districts, the only thing that I would just echo once more is IT security. Right? Like the product security, the infrastructure security, that's the sort of thing that companies like Clever can help with. But IT security is the long pole. And I think making sure that your students, your teachers, your administrators, everyone who has an account understands that this is something that's important for the entire district and is something that they ought to safeguard is super critical.
All right. Cool. Well, thank you, David, Elizabeth, Tim, and Mindy for this riveting conversation this afternoon. And I saw that there are some resources shared in chat as well, which is more the better, because there will be some tangible resources that you can all refer to or take a look at to get to speed on this space. So I want to thank you all for joining us and thank all of our panelists.